Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! One of Titanic's last radio messages, sent at about 1:40 in the morning on April 15, 1912, said the ship was sinking fast and passengers were being put into boats. Titanic went under at 2:20 that morning, and more than 1,500 people were lost in the North Atlantic. In 1835, Ngati Mutunga and Ngati Tama reached the Chatham Islands and overwhelmed the Moriori, whose pacifist code meant they did not fight back. About 300 Moriori died. The survivors were forced into slavery. Edward Peisnell wore this mask during a string of night-home invasions on Jersey, and its crude face turned him into one of the island's darkest legends. For 11 years, he targeted women and children, and the case became known as the Beast of Jersey. In 1929, Detroit police carried these strange papier-mâché figures from the basement of self-made prophet Benny Evangelist after his home became one of the city's darkest mysteries. Evangelist, his wife, and their 4 children were found dead. An iron mort safe like this was locked over fresh graves in Scotland to stop grave robbers from reaching the coffin. In Berlin, in 1945, a young Soviet boy stands beside a German general he helped capture, a real moment from the final collapse of the Third Reich. Berlin fell in May 1945 after weeks of street fighting, and even boys were drawn into the last battles of the city. After Italy's armistice in 1943, some captured Italian soldiers chose to keep fighting beside Germany instead of going to prison camps. They were turned into auxiliary troops for the Wehrmacht and the German-backed Italian Social Republic in 1943 and 1944. During the Apollo 13 emergency in April 1970, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Pete Conrad sat with James Lovell's family to watch the news and wait for updates from space. Apollo 13 returned safely on April 17, 1970. A Hungarian soldier stands beside a heap of stolen clothes and household items after Soviet scouts caught him in September 1942. The stolen goods were laid out on the ground and photographed as evidence at his feet. A Soviet Pacific Fleet sapper sweeps the shattered streets of Seychelles with a mine detector after the port changed hands in the final days of the war. Seychelles, now Chongjin in North Korea, was captured in August 1945 during the Soviet offensive against Japan. At 70 years old, Mark Hill wrote his penny farthing through Battersea in 1934, looking like a man from another century in middle of modern traffic. Penny farthings were most common in the 1870s and 1880s before safer low-wheel bicycles replaced them. Billy and Benny McCrary, known as the McGuire twins, became circus stars and pro wrestlers after Guinness named them the heaviest twins in the world. By their teens, each weighed about 600 pounds, and their act often featured synchronized rides on mini bikes. On April 15, 1954, Marilyn Monroe rehearsed a song at 20th-century Fox, turning a dressing room into a private stage between takes. The photos were shot on Kodachrome during her studio return. Around 1917, an Austro-Hungarian assault soldier stands in full field gear, part of a new type of troop built for fast frontline attacks in the First World War. By 1917, armies across Europe were forming small assault units to break the long deadlock of trench warfare. In the 1970s, small cars like the Chevrolet Vega were packed into multi-level rail carriers like this, with vehicles stacked in tight rows to save every bit of space. The Vega entered production in 1970, and its compact size made it well-suited for high-density rail shipment. At Fort Bragg on June 18, 1961, a jetpack pilot rose above the crowd in one of the most futuristic public demonstrations of the early space age. The Bell rocket belt could stay in the air for only about 20 seconds. Taken from the International Space Station on September 11, 2001, this view shows a long smoke plume stretching across Lower Manhattan and New York Harbor. Astronaut Frank Culbertson, the only American off Earth that day. In 1950, American children could buy chemistry sets with real atomic samples and listen to a Geiger counter click through headphones at home. The device was sensitive enough to detect the signal from a luminous wristwatch on the table. In 1969, this famous view of Buzz Aldrin fooled many people into thinking he was looking at Earth, but he was actually smiling at the camera on the moon. The photo was taken during Apollo 11 on July the 20th, 1969, the first human landing on the moon. In the 1960s, Macy's on 34th Street let shoppers buy men's shorts from a vending machine for just 97 cents, turning a basic item into a push-button purchase. Inside one of New York's most famous department stores, underwear could cost less than $1. In 1962, the experimental Soviet Gazi-16 looked like a car from the future as it passed through Gorky in front of a crowd. The Gazi-16 used an air cushion system instead of relying only on normal wheels. In October 1993, the Russian White House burned in Moscow during the deepest power struggle after the Soviet collapse. Army units fired on the Parliament building, and Boris Yeltsin used the victory to push a new constitution later that year. On May 9, 1944, Soviet soldiers celebrated on the shore after Sevastopol was retaken, with wrecked ships still visible behind them. Sevastopol had been under German control since July 1942, and its recapture marked the loss of Crimea for the Axis. On April 11, 1912, third-class passengers stood on Titanic's stern promenade during the ship's short stop at Queenstown, the last port before the open Atlantic. Just 4 days later, Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, with more than 1,500 people lost. In 1944, potatoes were dug up in front of the Swiss Parliament in Bern, as wartime shortages turned even the heart of government into farmland. Switzerland used public land across the country for food crops to raise domestic supply during the war. In 1949, this palm-sized camera made photography look almost unreal, small enough to disappear inside one hand. Miniature cameras like this used tiny film negatives and were built for places where a normal camera could not fit. In this English classroom from the 1920s, boys sit in rigid rows of wooden desks while their teacher watches from the back. Separate boys' classes were still common in England at that time, and many schoolrooms kept the same strict layout for decades. Around 1920 in Malmö, Sweden, this parachute test captured the moment an early canopy collapsed across the ground after landing. The trial was carried out at the central workshops in Malmö when parachutes were still new and experimental equipment. On October 4, 1918, this German aircraft ended up nose down in the Argonne after American machine gunners brought it down during the last weeks of the First World War. The crash happened between Montfaucon and Sierges in France. In 1920s South Australia, sacks of grain were weighed by hand before being rolled from wagon to rail, turning harvest into pure muscle work. Every bag passed over the scale before loading, and wheat moved one heavy sack at a time. On April 8, 1921, 3 Paris women stood on Place du Havre near Saint-Lazare station and looked up together as a solar eclipse dimmed the city. The eclipse was visible over France that day. Before women could vote nationwide in the United States, campaigns used displays like this national ballot box to raise money for the final push toward 1920. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920 and barred states from denying the vote on the basis of sex. In the 1920s, portraits like this showed a striking status symbol, with extremely long nails proving the hand was never used for hard labor. In parts of China, such nails could signal rank, wealth, and a life far removed from manual work. In 1924, B. Kyle posed beside a steam fire engine with giant wooden wheels, making the machine look almost unreal next to her. The vehicle used a tall steam boiler and wagon-style running gear. Known as the Leatherman, this silent traveler walked a fixed 365-mile route through New York and Connecticut while wearing a hand-sewn leather suit in all weather. He repeated the circuit about every 34 days for years, slept in caves. Shirley Slade sat at the controls as one of the women who flew military aircraft for the United States during the Second World War. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program trained more than 1,000 women, and they ferried planes, tested aircraft. During the First World War in Vienna, tobacco was treated almost like a daily necessity, with soldiers lining up as packets were counted out by hand. Each man was allowed 30 grams a day. In February 1943, an American soldier received an insignia tattoo on his forearm in George Burchett's studio on Waterloo Road in London. Burchett had been tattooing since the late 1800s, and wartime London brought streams of Allied servicemen to his chair. A smiling television actor stands beside his towering co-star in full studio makeup, and the size gap looks almost unreal, even without a trick angle. The tall actor was about 6 feet 5 inches, and heavy boots plus head makeup made him look even larger on screen. In 1925, a French shop window used lifelike male mannequins and pinned price tags to sell modern menswear with an almost eerie calm. The display comes from France in 1925, when window shopping had become a powerful new form of street advertising. In one of the strangest experiments linked to Nazi Germany, researchers tried to test whether a dog could receive human thoughts. The dog was placed between two observers and photographed beside tall metal cylinders during the trial. In the 1950s, life-size mannequins were placed inside model homes in the Nevada desert to show what a nuclear test could do to an ordinary family room. They were used at the Nevada test site, where cameras. In 1922, a United States government image presented a soldier in a gas mask as one of the new faces of modern military science. It appeared in the book Practical Physics, where protective equipment was explained as real-world applied technology. In 1961, the young presidential couple sat so still inside the car that they almost looked sculpted instead of photographed. He was 44 and she was 32 that year, making them one of the youngest first couples in modern American history. In 1986, a surfing championship in Huntington Beach turned surreal as a packed beach sat under a wall of black smoke. The smoke rose from cars burning during mass unrest in Huntington Beach, California, while thousands of people were still on the sand. In 1952, 10-year-old Betty Lee Bennett flew solo over Havana, turning the city below into the backdrop for a record-setting flight. She was reported as the youngest girl to complete a solo flight over Havana. In 1988, a mounted New York police officer arrested a suspect on a city sidewalk, with the horse standing just feet from the man on the ground. Photographer Don Hallisey captured the moment in New York City, where mounted police were still used for patrol and crowd control. In 1911, workers hauled Titanic's 16-ton anchor out of N. Hingley & Sons in Netherton, turning one ship part into a street spectacle. The anchor was one of the largest hand-forged pieces made for the liner before Titanic sailed in 1912. On April 13, 1982, Argentine soldiers bought postcards in Stanley just days after Argentine forces took the Falkland Islands. British forces retook Stanley on June 14, 1982, ending 74 days of Argentine control. In 1953, Hong Kong's harbor held whole boat neighborhoods, with thousands of people living in roofed craft packed side by side. Many families cooked, slept, and worked on the same boats, turning the water into a permanent home. In 1913, the French transport ship SS Kangaroo was photographed in Marseille, carrying a submarine inside its hollow stern, one of the strangest cargo sights of its time. Built in 1912, it was designed specifically to deliver submarines to South American countries. In 1943, a Soviet rifle crew practiced aiming a huge anti-tank gun at aircraft, a rare scene that made one weapon serve two very different roles. The PTRD was designed to hit armored vehicles, but crews were also trained to fire at low-flying planes. In 1899, huge chunks of a melting iceberg lay scattered along the shore at Gothab, now Nuuk, making Greenland's coast look like a field of broken stone. In 1924, President Calvin Coolidge stood on his Vermont farm with First Lady Grace Coolidge and their son John, far from the formality of Washington. Coolidge had become the 30th President of the United States in 1923 after Warren Harding died. During Nikita Khrushchev's United States visit in 1959, anti-communist protesters in Iowa lined the street with harsh signs as police watched the route. The photo was taken on September 23, 1959, in Des Moines during Khrushchev's Cold War tour of the United States. On April 21, 1978, Korean Airlines Flight 902 ended up on the ice of Lake Korpijärvi after drifting into Soviet airspace, turning a long international route into a frozen emergency landing. The Boeing 707 was flying from Paris to Anchorage. On May 10, 1933, Nazi crowds burned books in public squares as Germany turned against writers, science, and free thought. Works by Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, and Thomas Mann were among those thrown into the fires. In 1930s Italy, the Balilla turned children into uniformed youth ranks, taught to march, salute, and serve the regime. Its name came from a Genoa boy called Balilla, whose stone throw in 1746 was later turned into a national legend. 2 seconds after the Soviet test on August 29, 1949, the fireball over Kazakhstan was already rising into a massive column of light and cloud. This view was photographed from 5 kilometers away during the first Soviet atomic test. Written aboard Titanic on April 13, 1912, this letter says, "We will arrive in New York Wednesday," unaware the voyage had only 2 days left. Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, and the note survived as one of the last letters written on the ship. In 1940, Tower Bridge stood black against the glow over London during the Blitz. London was hit for 57 straight nights, starting on September 7, 1940. In Birmingham in 1943, Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maysky addressed British workers beside a tank built for the Soviet Union. British factories supplied tanks to the Soviet Union as part of Allied wartime aid. In May 1945, an American sergeant displayed ceremonial swords recovered with hidden Prussian royal treasures. The cache also included 1701 coronation regalia of Frederick I and Sophia Charlotte, including crowns and a scepter. On June 22, 1941, German soldiers crossed the Bug River as the invasion of the Soviet Union began at dawn. Operation Barbarossa opened the largest land campaign in history. In 1948, people rode on the steps and couplings of this train from Germany to Austria because there was not enough space inside. The scene shows how badly transport had broken down in Europe after the war. Around 1953, a man played a street piano at Amsterdam's Waterloop line, while buyers stood among second-hand goods and war surplus. Waterloop line had been a market since 1885 and became one of Amsterdam's best-known flea markets after the war. In Prague in May 1945, a Czech girl cups the face of a Soviet tank officer as crowds gather around them. The city passed out of German control on May 9, 1945. In March 1945, Soviet assault troops with backpack flamethrowers fought through the ruins of Kustrin, one of the last strongholds before Berlin. Kustrin fell that month, opening a direct road toward the final battle for the German capital. In 1973, Red Army veterans returned to Sormohyla in Donetsk region and knelt on the ground where they had fought 30 years earlier. Sormohyla was one of the key heights in the 1943 battles for the Donbass. Days after Bergen-Belsen was liberated in April 1945, 2 survivors stand with food bowls in a camp where tens of thousands were still alive among extreme hunger and disease. British troops entered on April 15, 1945, and found about 60,000 prisoners and more than 13,000 unburied bodies. Around 1900, a horse-drawn wagon moved through Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, beneath stone walls so large the travelers almost disappear. The canyon walls rise hundreds of feet above the floor. Warships crowd Shanghai Harbor in 1937 as smoke hangs over the city. The Battle of Shanghai began that year and turned the port into one of the first major fronts of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In Seoul, in 1941, a Russian Tatar shopkeeper modeled Japan's new national uniform while selling the same style in his store. The photo appeared in Keijo Nippo, and this uniform became mandatory across the empire in 1943. In April 1968, a paratrooper from Company A, 101st Airborne, signals a medical evacuation helicopter through the jungle southwest of Hue as soldiers pull wounded men together. The photo was taken during a 5-day patrol in South Vietnam. Thousands filled Bucharest in December 1989 as Nicolae Ceausescu's rule suddenly collapsed after decades of tight control. Romania was the last Eastern Bloc country to break from communist rule in 1989. Iranian troops moved through the ruined streets of Khorramshahr in 1980 during one of the first major clashes of the Iran-Iraq conflict. The city held out for about 34 days before Iraqi forces took control of it in October 1980. Burundi delegates raised their flag in East Berlin in 1973 during the 10th World Festival of Youth and Students, one of the biggest youth gatherings of the Cold War era. The festival happened in a city still cut by the Berlin Wall. Reza Shah Pahlavi stands at Persepolis around 1939, using the ancient royal city to link his rule with Persia's deep past. Persepolis was already more than 2,400 years old and remained one of Iran's strongest national symbols. Soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division posed at the Eagle's Nest in 1945 after United States forces reached the mountain retreat above Berchtesgaden. The building stood about 1,834 meters above sea level and had been finished in 1938. The football huddle began in 1894 when Gallaudet quarterback Paul Hubbard pulled his team close so rival players could not read his sign language. Hubbard was deaf, and the idea started at Gallaudet, a university for deaf and hard-of-hearing students. Built in Satka in 1972, this giant hammer and sickle monument turned a Soviet symbol into a massive concrete landmark. It still stands decades after the Soviet Union ended in 1991. Hank Williams and Billie Jean stand beside their wedding cake in New Orleans in 1952, with his stage style still fully on display at the reception. He was gone by January 1953 at age 29, only months after this photo was taken. British troops rest beside a shattered building at Athis in northern France in April 1917, using the ruins as a brief shelter between action. By that month, the war had already dragged on for nearly 3 years. In 1916, soldiers of the 267th Duhovschinsky Infantry Regiment fired from a trench while wearing protective masks, showing how quickly modern war had changed. By 1916, special masks had become standard gear on many fronts after gas spread across the battlefield. In spring 1917, crowds and members of the provisional government stood at new graves on Mars Field in Petrograd after the February Revolution broke Romanov rule. Within the same year, the provisional government fell and the Russian Empire vanished. Highland Light Infantry soldiers rest by the Menin Road on the 24th of September, 1917, just before moving forward in the Passchendaele campaign. The larger battle lasted from July to November 1917 and turned this ground into deep mud after months of rain and destruction. Robert Spedden poses with his toy polar bear in 1911, months before he survived the Titanic at age 6. He was lost in a car accident in 1914, only 3 years later. A farm family in Sheridan County, Kansas, stands with 11 children inside their home in 1939, in the final years of the Great Depression. The picture holds 13 people in one small room, with worn overalls and plain dresses, showing how little space and money they had. James A. Garfield appears here in 1881, just before becoming the 20th President of the United States, surrounded by huge flags at a grand public celebration. His presidency lasted only 200 days. In the 1950s, Heathrow was a bare airfield of 6 intersecting runways before its passenger terminals were built. Civilian flights began there in 1946, and most of that huge early runway pattern was later replaced by the layout used today. A teenager leans from a car in Georgia in 1956 with an anti-integration sign showing how openly segregation was defended in public. This came 2 years after the Supreme Court ruled school segregation unconstitutional in 1954. Jessica Lange takes a break on the set of King Kong in 1976, the film that launched her screen career. It was her first movie role, and she won an Academy Award 6 years later. At a 1973 rally in Noblesville, Indiana, 2 young black men walked up to a robed segregationist leader and flashed peace signs. John Blair captured the split second so suddenly that the man could only smile back. A Bosnian military imam leads prayer beside the new graves of 2 comrades during World War I, while soldiers kneel in silence around him. Bosnia was part of Austria-Hungary then, so many Bosnian Muslim soldiers fought under imperial command from 1914 to 1918. Jane Snyder and a child stand at a 1925 Ku Klux Klan service, both dressed in white robes during one of the group's public gatherings. In the 1920s, the organization claimed millions of members and held open events across the United States. In Tulsa in 1921, Greenwood, a prosperous black district known as Black Wall Street, was left in ruins after 2 days of racial violence. More than 800 people were injured. Over 10,000 lost their homes, and no white attacker was arrested. 3 sisters learned to skate on frozen ice in Central Park in 1940, with one already down while the others stay upright. Central Park had been a public skating spot since the 19th century, long before most people knew indoor rinks. In 1910, West Side Market was still a rough open-air maze of wagons, horses, and shoppers pushing through snow and mud. The famous Market Hall had not opened yet and would rise there 2 years later in 1912. Hundreds of thousands filled New York on April 15, 1967, for one of the biggest anti-Vietnam War marches in United States history. The crowd moved from Central Park to the United Nations, where Martin Luther King spoke as the streets turned into a wall of protest signs. Moscow's Central Telegraph Building on Gorky Street was covered in giant Soviet banners in 1954, turning a key communication center into a massive state display. Gorky Street got back its old name, Tverskaya, in 1990. Opened in Volgograd in 1985, this Stalingrad Battle Memorial used a huge curved concrete form to mark one of the most decisive battles of World War II. The city had been called Stalingrad until 1961. A decorated veteran stands in Kazan in 1988 with a chest full of Soviet medals before memorial walls covered in names. The panels behind him list officers and Red Army soldiers line after line, turning one portrait into a whole generation. Doctors step out of a Mil-Me-4 into deep snow in the Uzbek Soviet Republic in the 1970s, bringing medical care to a mountain village cut off by winter. Helicopters let Soviet doctors reach remote patients across vast distances that cars could not cross. Charles de Gaulle walks with his daughter Anne in the 1930s, years before he became the leader of Free France and later president. Anne had Down syndrome and stayed with her family until her death in 1948 at age 20. A woman sits on a Beirut beach around 1975 with the skyline still open and bright behind her. That year marked the start of a 15-year civil war that transformed Beirut. Winston Churchill stands at George S. Patton's grave in 1946, honoring one of the most famous Allied generals only months after the war in Europe ended. Patton died in a car accident in December 1945, so this tribute came less than 1 year after victory. In 1937, Benito Mussolini raised the ceremonial sword of Islam in Libya during a staged campaign meant to win support from Muslim communities under Italian rule. He was even given the title Protector of Islam. Beauregard sits for a formal portrait in 1863, already one of the most famous Confederate generals of the American Civil War. He had led the Fort Sumter operation in 1861, the event that started the war. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments, which historical shot did you like the most, and for what reason? An indigenous Huitoto girl stands beside the man who controlled her family in the Peruvian Amazon around 1908 during the rubber boom. After a dispute with a Peruvian rubber company, several Huitoto families were forced to move more than 1,000 miles from their homeland. In 1932, outlaws tied to Pretty Boy Floyd tried to rob a bank in Boley, Oklahoma, a historic black town known for armed self-defense. Floyd warned them not to try it, and most of the robbers did not survive the gunfight. Louis-Auguste Blanqui was a French revolutionary who spent more than 50 years trying to overturn the old order in France. By 1880, he had spent about 33 years in prison and had already influenced later figures such as Karl Marx. Friedrich Nietzsche appears here in a rare signed portrait from the late 1800s sent to Meta von Salis, a Swiss writer and women's rights activist. Signed photos from him are extremely rare, which is why this one sold for $40,640 at auction. In Beijing in 1900, wealthy merchants dine with hired entertainers, capturing a private social world few cameras entered. The photo was taken during the final years of the Qing dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty, which ended in 1911. Colombia's market square in 1938 still looked like a slow border town, where carts, early cars, and shoppers shared the same wide street. At that time, the city was in Poland, but today, Colombia is in western Ukraine. A Palestinian woman gathers grapes in Ain Yabrud in 1937, showing everyday village life near Ramallah before the region changed forever. This was 11 years before 1948, when the map of the land was redrawn and millions of lives were upended. In 1936, a family pauses beside a car marked Oregon or Bust, showing how desperate the search for a new life had become during the Great Depression. In the 1930s, millions of Americans lost work, and many drove west hoping to find jobs, land, or simply a way to survive. John Brown was an American anti-slavery activist who seized a federal weapons store at Harper's Ferry in 1859, hoping enslaved people would rise against slavery. Virginia put him to death on December 2, 1859, and the raid pushed the United States closer to the Civil War. Before he became world famous, Charles Lindbergh flew the first airmail route from Chicago to St. Louis on April 15, 1926. The flight took 2 hours and 30 minutes and landed 8 minutes ahead of schedule. Around 1890, a Swedish farm woman feeds her pig in the snow, capturing a quiet piece of everyday rural life. The image survives as a glass negative, a fragile early photo format used before modern film. An Egyptian wedding procession poses in 1895 with drummers and musicians gathered around the entrance. The image was made in the age of early studio photography, when a large group photo like this took time, planning, and complete stillness. A young band member of the Irish Guards, a British Army regiment, stands in Waterford Barracks in 1917 beside the regiment's giant Irish wolfhound mascot. The dog was named Leitrim Boy and was 9 years old when this photo was taken. An Australian nurse stands with Jiminy, a pet kangaroo and mascot at the first Australian Auxiliary Hospital around 1916 during World War I. Even in a military hospital far from home, the staff kept a kangaroo beside them as a living piece of Australia. Mary Pickford, one of the biggest silent film stars in the world, poses with a camera on a California beach in 1916. 3 years later, in 1919, she co-founded United Artists, giving top actors rare control over their own films. In October 1918 in the Netherlands, a refugee boy holds a piece of bread given to him by a soldier after weeks of travel during World War I. For many displaced children then, even one small piece of food could mean the difference between going hungry and eating that day. Skiers pose near Mount Kosciuszko around 1926, showing that snowy mountain life in Australia was very real long before modern resorts. Mount Kosciuszko is the highest mountain on mainland Australia at 2,228 meters. In about 1923, two children shake hands at a public event while adults watch behind them. The feathered costume shows how Native American identity was often turned into pageant dress in the United States at that time. Margaret D. Foster works in a United States government lab in 1919, when newspapers called her Uncle Sam's only woman chemist. The photo shows how rare it still was for a woman to hold that kind of federal science job at the time. Jeanne Malivel, a French artist from Brittany, stands in her studio in Ludic around 1920, surrounded by her paintings and sketches. She died in 1926 at just 31, but became one of the key faces of modern Breton art. Four men who shaped the piece after World War I stand together in Paris in 1919. Their talks led to the Treaty of Versailles, which redrew Europe and left deep anger in Germany that later helped open the way to World War II. Nurses in full protective clothing treat a flu patient at a United States Navy hospital in New Orleans in 1918 during the worldwide influenza outbreak. The crisis overwhelmed hospitals across the world and made masks, isolation, and heavy protective gear part of daily care. Mortimer's shop in Waterford in 1916 was packed with tea, sweets, fruit, and tins stacked right behind the family in the doorway. The window turned a small local store into a full street display. Women work metal lathes at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, London, in May 1918, making copper cases for artillery shells during World War I. The war pushed huge numbers of women into factory jobs, and work like this changed British industry for years after 1918. At Sydney markets around 1911 to 1916, workers sort and bag piles of potatoes by hand in an open warehouse. Before modern supermarkets, food moved through places like this, where men weighed, packed, and sold produce one sack at a time. In 1916, Mrs. Meadows and Emily Rankin sold flowers for a Red Cross fundraiser in Targominda, Australia, using a baby carriage as their moving stall. The carriage is covered with flowers and Australian flags, and the girl's sleeve carries the Red Cross sign. A camper shaves outside his tent in England around 1925 to 1935, with his bicycle hanging upside down nearby for repairs or storage. The photo shows how early campers handled daily life outdoors with only a small tent and a few basic supplies. In March 1923, André Citroën, founder of the French car company Citroën, returned to Paris after his team's first automobile crossing of the Sahara Desert. The trip turned a vast desert once crossed slowly by caravan into a global advertisement for the new age of motor travel. Wes Colquhoun and Fred Fair talk with young women at a dance in Drouin, a small town in Victoria, Australia, in 1916. Taken during the World War I, the photo shows how local halls stayed full of music and social life even in wartime. In 1920, a performer at a women's voting rights convention in Chicago leans into the ears of the Democratic donkey, the symbol of the Democratic Party. The photo was taken the same year the 19th Amendment gave many women in the United States the right to vote. 4 American Red Cross nurses arrived in San Francisco in 1920 after serving in Siberia in eastern Russia, where they cared for civilians and refugees after World War I. Some worked in hospitals in Vladivostok, while others treated refugees on Rusky Island, thousands of miles from home. Charles Abel Corwin, an American landscape painter, stands with Miss E. Edgerton before a huge painted backdrop in 1923. The work is so large that it turns the studio into part workshop and part stage set. Jose de Souza Magano was a 15-year-old boy in Fall River, Massachusetts, photographed in 1916 after returning from the Azores with no schooling. He could not read or write in Portuguese or English, so officials refused his work permit and sent him to school instead. William M. Jardine The new head of the United States Department of Agriculture inspects an amaryllis display in a greenhouse in 1925. The towering flowers turned a government plant show into a public spectacle. Ernest Hemingway, a famous American writer, walks with his wife Martha Gellhorn and his 3 sons in Idaho in 1941. This family photo was taken 13 years before he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. Charles Manson appears here on his wedding day in 1955, looking like an ordinary young husband. 14 years later, he became the leader of the Manson family, the group linked to the 1969 Sharon Tate case that shocked the United States. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the outlaw couple chased across the United States during the Great Depression, posed together in 1933. Just 1 year later, in 1934, both were dead after their crime spree made them 2 of the most famous fugitives in American history. John Flansburgh of They Might Be Giants stands between Mickey and Minnie in the early 1990s, looking caught in a strange pop culture crossover. About 20 years later, he helped write the theme song for Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. During World War I, soldiers used papier-mâché heads above trench walls to draw enemy shots without exposing a real person. These strange decoys turned paint, paper, and wire into a life-saving trick on the front. A Navajo man performs the night chant in 1904 while dressed as Nyanesgani, a hero figure in Navajo tradition. The night chant was a healing ceremony that lasted several days and used song, ritual dress, and sacred performance. Afghan Mujahideen fighters wear Soviet gas masks in March 1981 during the Soviet War in Afghanistan. The war began after the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan in 1979, and photos like this show how local fighters often used captured Soviet equipment. During an anti-Vietnam War protest in 1969, a demonstrator in a pig mask appears behind a police officer, creating one of the strangest street images of the era. The pig mask used a common protest symbol of the late 1960s, when many activists used pigs to mock police and authority. Ted Bundy and his girlfriend Liz sit together in Utah in 1975, looking like an ordinary young couple. By then, he had already attacked many women, and before his execution in 1989, he confessed to 30 killings. These 3 boys were drummer boys for the Confederate Army, the Southern side in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. By the time this photo was taken, they had already survived 9 battles. Young Walt Disney, the future creator of Mickey Mouse and Disneyland, stands on the right beside his friend Walt Pfeiffer in Abraham Lincoln costumes around 1912 to 1914. Disney was born in 1901, so he was only about 11 to 13 years old when this photo was taken. Riders in giant masks passed through the Nice Carnival in France in the 1910s, turning the street into a moving fantasy show. Nice was already one of Europe's most famous carnival cities, and scenes like this drew huge winter crowds before World War I changed the continent. Charles Cunningham stands for a police mugshot in North Shields, England, on 9 February 1903 after an arrest on a public indecency charge. The board in his hands records his name, the charge, the police station, and the exact date. Dancers from the Rite of Spring appear here in 1913 from the new ballet by Russian composer Igor Stravinsky that stunned Paris audiences. Its Paris premiere on 29 May 1913 caused one of the most famous audience uproars in stage history. Passengers crowd the deck of the steamship Vestris in 1928 as the ocean liner tilts shortly before it goes down in the Atlantic. More than 100 people were lost, and only a few of the women and children on board survived. San Francisco City Hall stands broken after the great 1906 earthquake, with its giant dome still rising over the damaged building. The quake and the fires that followed transformed the city and became one of the biggest urban disasters in United States history. James Dean, the young Hollywood star of Rebel Without a Cause, drives his silver Porsche 550 Spyder on September 30th, 1955, in one of the last photos taken before his car crash. He was only 24, and the crash happened later that same day in California. A rare candid photo shows two top Nazi leaders in an unusually playful moment, far from the stiff image their regime tried to project. Photos like this are rare because most images of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels were tightly staged for propaganda. Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's older brother, was a Russian student revolutionary photographed in 1886. He was put to death at age 21 after joining a plot against Tsar Alexander III, and the shock helped shape the man who later led the Russian Revolution of 1917. Built in Preston, England, in 1974, this plastic school building was one of the first in the world shaped with computer design. It still stands on Kennington County Road and is still in use today. Communist marchers crossed the mud of Red Square in Moscow on November 7, 1927, during a Soviet anniversary parade. On the left stands Lenin's temporary wooden mausoleum, which was later replaced by the stone tomb known today. Father Yod, born Jim Baker, sits with women from the Source family, a California commune that became one of the best-known alternative groups of the 1970s. The group grew out of his Los Angeles health food restaurant. St. Paul's Cathedral in London was damaged in 1940 during the Blitz, the German air raids on Britain in World War II. Even after the strike tore open part of the roof, the Great Dome remained standing. Soviet soldiers rest by a campfire on Sakhalin in August 1945 during the Soviet push into the southern part of the island that was held by Japan near the end of World War II. The photo captures a rare quiet moment only weeks before Japan surrendered. Adolf Hitler speaks from Vienna's Hofburg balcony in March 1938 after Germany took control of Austria, as a huge crowd fills the square below. The annexation ended Austria's independence and pulled the country into Nazi Germany just 1 year before World War II began. Russian explorer Nikolai Miklóhó-Maklay sits with an indigenous Papuan in 1874 during his work in New Guinea. Local people called him the White Papuan because he lived among them for years and argued that all people were equal. Joseph Stalin, ruler of the Soviet Union, kisses Arctic aviator Ivan Spirin in 1937 after a celebrated Soviet polar expedition. The photo shows how the Soviet state turned explorers into national heroes at the height of Stalin's power. A Swiss farmer prepares a cow for a cattle show in Oberdorf in 1942, using a special tool to mark the animal before judging. Even during World War II, livestock shows still continued in neutral Switzerland. British troops take down an Italian fascist monument in Kismayo in 1941 after seizing the port in Italian Somaliland, a former Italian colony in East Africa during World War II. The broken column shows how quickly imperial symbols could collapse when control of a city changed hands. The Arch of the Filaini rose in the Libyan desert in 1937 as a giant gateway marking the joining of western and eastern Libya under Italian rule. It was built over the new coastal highway so drivers could pass straight through the monument. German and Italian troops stand in Tripoli, Libya, in 1941 beside a horse statue of Benito Mussolini, the ruler of fascist Italy, when Libya was still an Italian colony during World War II. British forces captured Tripoli in 1943. Italian Bersaglieri troops escort Benito Mussolini's car in snowy northern Italy in 1944 or 1945 as he visited the Italia division before it moved toward the Gothic line. By then, Mussolini was no longer the ruler of all Italy. Dr. Thomas Poulter unveils the snow cruiser model in Chicago on July 14, 1939, a huge wheeled machine built for an Antarctic expedition. The real vehicle reached Antarctica, but moved so badly on snow that it became one of the strangest engineering failures of its time. On October 7, 1959, the Soviet spacecraft Luna 3 sent back the first image of the far side of the moon, the half that never faces Earth. Even this blurry frame changed space history because no human had ever seen that side before. Joan Collins takes a break while painting her new Beverly Hills home in 1979. 2 years later, she became Alexis Carrington in Dynasty and turned into a television icon. A 1934 Coca-Cola delivery truck looks more like a rolling soda bar than a normal work vehicle. Its curved body and built-in drink station show how brands were already turning trucks into moving advertisements. The Walsh family poses for a formal portrait on 21st May 1919, with 6 children arranged carefully around their parents. The sharp detail comes from a glass negative, an early photo method that could capture far clearer images than most prints of the time. Marilyn Monroe takes a tired break between shots of The 7-Year Itch in 1954. The film came out in 1955, and its white dress scene became one of the most famous images in movie history. An artist paints the shattered ruins of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, capturing disaster while the city still lay broken around him. The quake and the fires that followed destroyed large parts of the city and left more than 200,000 people homeless. A soldier stands beside his mother in a strawberry field in Florin, California, in 1942. The photo puts war and farm life in the same frame as families kept growing food at home during World War II. Mariska Hargitay poses on Malibu Beach in 1982, years before she became the star of Law and Order, Special Victims Unit. She was only 18 here, long before television made her one of the most familiar faces in America. The giant moa of New Zealand could reach about 3 meters in height, making it one of the tallest birds ever known. All moa were gone by about 1500, centuries before photography existed. Laika became the first dog to orbit Earth when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 in 1957. The mission had no return system, and she did not survive the flight. The black circle was not part of the scene. It was punched into the negative after a United States government editor rejected the frame during the Great Depression. More than 175,000 images from that photo project survived. The last known image of the Andrea Gale crew was taken in 1991, shortly before the fishing boat vanished in the North Atlantic. Days later, Hurricane Grace, a cold front, and a powerful low joined into the weather event, later called the perfect storm. Diving horses became one of the strangest popular shows in the United States, with horses jumping from platforms as high as 18 meters into water. The act was removed from Atlantic City's Steel Pier in the 1970s after animal welfare protests. Pablo Escobar built La Catedral as his own prison in 1991 after making a deal with the Colombian government. The Hilltop complex had a football field, bar, jacuzzi, and waterfall, and he escaped from it in 1992. In 1923, Germany hyperinflation made paper money so cheap that some families used banknotes to heat the stove. Prices could rise so fast that wages lost value within hours, turning cash into paper almost overnight. At the 1964 Democratic National Convention, delegates filled the hall with Lyndon B. Johnson signs beneath the huge "Let Us Continue" banner. Weeks earlier, he had signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that November, he won more than 61% of the popular vote. On January 17, 1991, men at a diner read extra editions as the First Gulf War began. The giant one-word headline appeared the same day United States-led forces launched Operation Desert Storm after Iraq refused to leave Kuwait. In October 1937, Wallace Simpson and Prince Edward met Adolf Hitler in Germany, less than a year after Edward gave up the British throne to marry her. By then, he was the Duke of Windsor, and the visit became one of the most controversial moments linked to the former king. James A. Garfield is seen in 1881, just before taking office as the 20th President of the United States. His presidency lasted only about 200 days, one of the shortest for any elected United States president. In April 1945, United States Airman Fred D. Venables took this photo from a B-24 as another bomber crossed the sky over the target below. The image was made only weeks before Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. In 1894, Korean guards posed with Qing soldiers in Pyongyang after a major battle in the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan took the city on September 15, 1894, and the war soon ended, Qing rule over Korea. In 1972, Salvador Dali presented Francisco Franco with a painting of Franco's granddaughter, Carmen Martínez Bordiú, bringing Spain's most famous surrealist face to face with its aging leader. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt stopped to speak with farmers near Warm Springs, Georgia, as he campaigned for the White House during the Great Depression. Just months later, he won 42 of 48 states and launched the New Deal, which changed life across rural America. In 1969, Swan Hunter built the Esso Northumbria at Wallsend, then the largest ship ever constructed in the United Kingdom. The vessel was a giant oil tanker designed to carry huge amounts of crude oil in a single trip. Alfred Packer returned alone from a Colorado gold trip in 1874 after 5 other men disappeared in the mountains. He later confessed that he survived by eating his companions, and the case became one of the most notorious stories of the American frontier. In 1901, George Cortelyou tried twice to remove Buffalo's Temple of Music from President William McKinley's schedule because he feared the site was unsafe. McKinley kept the stop, and that visit became the place where his presidency ended days later. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.